Thanks very much indeed, of course, for the invitation from Northeast Surrey for Europe to come back. It's always lovely to see some familiar faces. Hello, Evelyn. Um, so I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes or so about development since the end of the UK's transition period, which was almost a year ago. It's very almost a year ago, and I'm going to do that along three main axes. First of all, the broad framework of EU-UK relations, which is now provided for under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Secondly, then, as Evelyn said, more specifically, what's happening with Northern Ireland in relation to the border protocol, which is contained in the withdrawal agreement between the EU and the UK. And then thirdly, I'll finish with some comments on the internal dynamics of the UK itself. Now that we've taken back control and regained our sovereignty, what glorious things is Boris Johnson doing with that control, and what use is he making of that sovereignty? So those are the three things I'll talk about, and I'll just get stuck in. When it comes to EU-UK relations since the end of the transition period, I mean, I think it's always useful just to remember the basic choice which lay at the UK's feet after the referendum in 2016. Either the UK could opt for a relatively close future relationship with the EU, or it could opt for a relatively distant future relationship with the EU. Now, a close relationship would mean minimizing disruption in the economy and security and so on, and making the situation in Northern Ireland less difficult and less precarious to manage. But of course, it inevitably would have meant continued alignment with at least some, if not a great deal, of the EU's own regulatory standards, policy, strategic choices. So even this soft Brexit, as it became nicknamed, was always going to be a less destructive Brexit, but it was going to come at the frankly insane price of the UK swapping its position of leadership and influence in Europe for a position of no particular leadership and much less influence, just to minimize the damage of Brexit itself. A frankly bizarre situation to be in, but that was one choice. The alternative was that the UK could opt for a relatively abrupt severance of its relationship with the EU that would tally, at least at a very superficial level, with the whole slogan of taking back control. But of course, this hard Brexit, as it became known, would mean unprecedented disruption to the UK's cooperation with the EU in terms of the economy and strategic interests in foreign policy, defence and so on. And it would also make the situation in Northern Ireland much more challenging, much more difficult, much more destabilising in terms of the peace process and cross-community relations. Now, we know that Theresa May, for all her faults, and they were many, I am not going to in any way claim that Theresa May was a positive or likable character, let alone politician, but for all her many, many faults, she did opt in the end for a relatively soft Brexit. Not entirely, not unambiguously. She did everything she could to disguise this choice and make it appear not to be the choice that she was making. But she did in the end opt for a relatively soft Brexit. And we can assume that she did so because she's not a complete psychopath, because she did realize, first of all, that it wasn't in the UK's national interest to embark upon a deliberate programme of serious self-harm. And secondly, because she does genuinely seem to have grasped and feared the implications of for Northern Ireland of any alternative course of action. Now, Johnson and his cabal, when they ousted May and seized control for themselves, their basic policy, of course, their basic policy action was to recalculate the whole equation around withdrawal. There had to be a hard Brexit. There had to be a hard Brexit, whatever the costs. They either genuinely didn't believe what those costs would be, or they simply didn't care what the costs would be. But whichever way, there had to be a hard Brexit. And they just didn't not care about the costs from an economic, from a social point of view for the UK as a whole, but also when it came to the situation in Northern Ireland. Now, in that regard, of course, all of the expert predictions have been proven pretty much entirely correct. Johnson got his hard Brexit. It is causing serious economic problems, albeit that many of them are effectively disguised by the impact of COVID and the effects of the pandemic and the economic challenges of the pandemic itself. But it has caused serious economic problems, and those economic problems will continue for a very long time to come. It's also caused enormous tension between the UK and its former partners and allies, I think it's fair to say that Johnson's policies have caused a serious rift in the whole system of the Western Alliance, upon which, whether you like it or not, our interests as a civilization depend. And it's also, of course, undermined political stability in Northern Ireland in a way that we'll come back to shortly. But let's just say a few more words about Johnson's basic calculation. Because the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is a hard Brexit. There's no other way to put it. It is a hard Brexit. Yes, of course, it's better to have fewer tariffs to pay than lots of tariffs to pay. And yes, of course, it's better to have some degree of cooperation in the field of crime and anti-terrorism than it is to have no cooperation at all. Of course, those things are true. But fundamentally, across the board, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is such a downgrading of EU-UK relations compared to 5 decades of UK membership of the EU itself, or indeed compared to any of the softer Brexits that were on offer from the EU, that for many sectors, for many actors, there may as well be no agreement at all. There may as well simply be no agreement at all. And indeed, it's fair to say that Johnson brought about a Brexit which is so uncompromising in its rejection of the UK's previous relationship with the rest of Europe that it was once advocated only by a lunatic fringe on the far right of the Leave spectrum, only by a lunatic fringe. These are the people we used to laugh at and say they should probably be locked up for their own safety. But these are the people whose vision has actually been delivered by Boris Johnson. But in a way, just as important as the fact of hard Brexit, and this is a fact, this is not a matter of interpretation or opinion. It's not for some Leave person to come along and say, oh no, you're trying to bend it. No, this is simply a fact. Just as important in a way as the fact of hard Brexit is the way that the Johnson regime manages its responsibility for what it's done. And in that regard, his tactics haven't changed 1 ounce since 2016. Remember, the basic toolkit of any post-truth populist, and Boris Johnson is cut from exactly the same cloth as the Trumps, the Bolsonaros, the Orbans, and so on. It's very simple and very effective. You tell gigantic lies, not little lies. People catch those out. You tell big, fat, juicy lies. You sell magic bean fantasies. The more magical, the better. When reality then keeps proving you wrong, you simply double down even harder and even further. You deny any degree of responsibility or culpability, and you blame everything else on scapegoats. Everything is the fault of other people. And then you tell more lies and more fantasies and more scapegoats and more blah, 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 blah. And that's basically what we've seen for the past 12 months. First of all, we're told there are no difficulties. Everything is world-leadingly brilliant. Everything in the UK is simply world-beating and marvelous. Yes, maybe okay, there are a few hiccups here and there, but they're the result of the pandemic. Everything is the fault of global supply chain problems, even though lots of other countries are not experiencing those problems on anywhere near the scale of the UK itself. And anyway, Brexit was always going to have a few teething problems. You can't forge a new global superpower from the ashes of the wreck that was Britain under the EU yoke without breaking a few eggs. So there was inevitably going to have to be some damage out of Brexit. But after all, the broken Britain that Boris Johnson inherited was only broken not because of a decade, for example, of Tory government. It was only broken by EU migrants. All those low-skilled, low-productivity foreigners who were jumping the queue, using their free movement rights to come here and steal everybody's jobs and drive down wages. And of course, the most important thing of all, nobody in the UK talks about Brexit anymore. We're all over it. We've forgotten all about it. It's only the vicious, nasty, bitter Europeans who are still obsessed by Brexit because all they want to do is punish poor little Britain for declaring its independence from the EU SSR. This is a diet of Soviet-style propaganda, and it's all we've heard from this government for the past 12 months. Gleefully repeated and embellished, of course, by their media lackeys. The problem is it's not just propaganda, because at every opportunity, the Johnson government has sought to stoke tension, even proper confrontation with the EU. Insults and provocations on a virtually weekly basis, little breaches of the trade and cooperation here, little breaches of the trade and cooperation there, basically trying to set up the EU and the UK not as partners and friends, but as rivals and antagonists. Now, what's true for the core Leave project, the hard Brexit, is also true for one of its primary victims, which is the situation in Northern Ireland. And this brings me on to my second main topic. Again, we all know the story here very well. I'll only recall the main plot lines. I'll take a little swig of beer to my poor dry throat. We knew from the moment that he took power that Boris Johnson was going to treat Northern Ireland as collateral damage to a hard Brexit. And it was inevitable that that collateral damage was going to consist of a border down the Irish Sea, of exactly the type that no British Prime Minister would ever agree to, blah, 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 blah. We knew that Boris Johnson proposed and agreed to a system of checks and controls, barriers and costs on the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, because that's what he signed. And I am a literate person who is capable of reading the English language. That's what he signed. And that's exactly what was due to come into force at the end of the transition period. Now, we always suspected that Johnson renegotiated the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland only with the most cynical of motivations. So he could claim that Brexit was done and he didn't actually care less about the consequences or having to actually deal with the fallout of his own agreement. Now, the truth is, even if the protocol were to work exactly as planned, it was always going to be problematic. And we shouldn't sort of idealize or romanticize this protocol as some sort of perfect solution to the problems facing Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland was always going to be damaged by Brexit. There was no such thing as a Brexit that wasn't going to damage Northern Ireland. What the protocol does is provide a workable solution to the problem of the UK having a hard Brexit while not having a physical border across the island of Ireland. So that means that Northern Ireland retains certain advantages in terms of continued access to the customs union, the single market that the rest of the UK have given up. But it doesn't change the fact that the protocol is a very complex settlement built on a series of compromises, and that every main participant and every stakeholder is losing something out of the protocol, albeit for the greater good of maintaining the peace process and preventing a much more serious destabilization of Northern Ireland itself. On the EU side, the main compromise, and this is never, of course, discussed in the UK context, apart from by people like us, I suppose, the EU made a major concession here, one which many Europeans feel deeply uncomfortable with. And it's very striking to me that when I talk about the Northern Ireland situation with colleagues in Italy and France and Germany, this really is a very difficult thing for them to swallow. A major part of the EU's external frontier is now being controlled and administered by a third country, not by the EU itself, but by a third country. And to be frank, it is a third country which has proven itself totally untrustworthy and not up to the job. Now, this is the reality for the EU. It's given up control over part of its own external frontier so as to preserve peace in Northern Ireland. This is never recognised in the UK. It's never acknowledged by the UK government, but that is the big compromise that the EU made in this context. As for the UK itself, the compromise is also quite obvious. Johnson agreed to basically split up the UK as an economic entity with a trading border down the Irish Sea. Now, of course, there was already a degree to which there was a trading border down the Irish Sea. There were already checks and controls between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This is a change in quantity rather than a change in quality, as it were. And of course, one of the impacts of Brexit is that within the UK itself, there is a whole new system of trade relations between England, Scotland and Wales, not just Northern Ireland, but there's a whole new system of trade relations between the rest of the UK, with new barriers to trade and new rules that try and govern the way that Scotland trades with that England trades with Wales. Because we used to let the EU and its single market rules deal with all of that stuff before, and now we don't have it anymore. We need to deal with that ourselves. So the UK made a compromise here, but let's not pretend that it's some gigantic fundamental change in the constitutional order of the UK. It's a change of degree, not a change of kind. It's easy to say, I suppose, that there were always going to be problems with the protocol. The key point really is we've got no real idea what those problems are actually like, because we've never actually seen the protocol operate in practice as it was intended to. because the UK, from the very moment the ink was even dry on that text, has done everything it can to go back on its word. Everything it can to misrepresent, frustrate, and undermine the agreement that Boris Johnson himself proposed, signed, won a general election on, and then passed through Parliament. Now, besides consistently lying in Parliament and to the public about the nature and the content of that agreement, of course, we saw a whole period of time where the UK delayed publication of its detailed operational plans to actually make the protocol work in practice. When the UK did finally publish those plans, they were just a blatant attempt to try and rewrite the protocol by stealth. Last autumn, we had the threat to use the UK Internal Market Bill simply to rewrite and reject whole parts of the withdrawal agreement. Then came the decision unilaterally to refuse to comply with a whole set of clear obligations under the protocol about checks on goods moving to Northern Ireland. And then most recently, of course, David Frost's completely cynical and totally unreasonable demands to simply scrap and replace the protocol altogether. Every day, we still hear fluctuating reports about how well or how badly the EU-UK negotiations are going over this issue, whether they might reach an amicable conclusion, what types of compromises might be made. And the whole time we live under the constant threat of the UK deciding simply to unilaterally suspend the entire system and frankly precipitate an open and quite profound crisis in Northern Ireland, but also between the EU and the UK. Now, on one level, the behaviour of the Johnson regime is almost incomprehensible. To any rational and decent human being, this behaviour is virtually incomprehensible. The EU and the UK spent years working out a workable deal. Nobody says it's perfect, nobody thinks it's wonderful, but it's a workable deal to protect Northern Ireland from the worst impacts of choices that were made in London, by nobody else, made in London. And it's bad enough that the Johnson regime has consciously set out to torpedo this workable deal that it itself proposed and agreed. But what makes, in a way, Johnson's behaviour even worse is that they have no credible alternative. There is no alternative on the table for the UK that could replace this protocol that they actually want to destroy. Far from it, the Johnson government has simply retreated to its infantile position. We want to have our cake and we want to eat it. Johnson's default mode of life, apparently, is that he simply is an entitled, I nearly used a very bad word there. I've got to be very careful because every time I talk about Boris Johnson, my language begins to deteriorate very quickly, but I'm in very polite company. So I'll just say he's a very entitled human being. The UK wants to have its hard Brexit. They don't want to have a hard border in Ireland, but they don't want to have a border down the Irish Sea either. So give it to us. Just make it up, give it to us, create it. This is an alternative reality in which the UK simply wants to have its cake and eat it. But on another level, if to a rational, decent human being, the Johnson government's behaviour seems incomprehensible, actually on another level, it's perfectly in keeping and consistent with its wider tactics and antics. Johnson couldn't care less about Northern Ireland, just as he couldn't care less about Liverpool or London or Edinburgh or frankly any of the rest of the country. We're all just pawns in his jolly game of psychopathic narcissism. When it comes to poor old Northern Ireland, the protocol effectively is simply another source of raw material for the Brexitists to practice their post-truth populism. Lies and fantasies, scapegoats, no responsibility. We're told now, and this is written down, can you believe this is written down in an official Whitehall documents published to the world and there forever on the historical record, that poor Boris Johnson was bullied and blackmailed into signing this awful protocol by an alliance between traitorous Remainer MPs in Parliament and the awful devious foreigners in Brussels and Paris and Berlin. And then only a couple of weeks ago, we were told that actually it was all Theresa May's fault because Theresa May was so weak and let the EU walk all over her that Theresa May actually laid the foundations for this protocol and made it happen. No mention, of course, that one of the reasons for Theresa May's weaknesses was the constant attacks of Boris Johnson and his cronies on her government itself. So now, who could blame poor little Boris Johnson for trying to throw off the shackles of this terrible protocol? After all, the evil Europeans have threatened, and they say this in Parliament, this is on the Hansard record. He said that the EU was threatening to use food shortages in Northern Ireland to blackmail the UK into accepting the protocol. Absolutely shocking stuff. But it's all part of their wider plan. The UK can't get away with Brexit. It has to be punished because the dictators in Brussels need to show that the UK has to pay a price for its choices. This is all predictable, it's all tiresome, it's insulting, and it's deeply frustrating. But the fact is, whether we're talking about the TCA and the wider relationship between the EU and the UK, or whether we're talking about the protocol and the specific situation involving Northern Ireland, there is a perfectly rational and coherent plan at work in the behaviour of the Johnson government. Brexit was sold to the population as a project of national rejuvenation. It was a revolution that would have no downsides and only considerable upsides. And on converse to that, the EU itself was portrayed as this failing organisation that was about to collapse under the weight of its own tyranny. Britain was merely leading the way and the rest would quickly follow. Of course, we know Brexit is being revealed steadily and surely as simply a project of national self-harm, the prolongation of an experience of national misery that will last probably for a full generation before we simply rejoin the EU again. And then we'll look back and think, what a bloody waste of time and effort and life that was. There are no clear or convincing gains. There are only enormous disbenefits and problems. As for the EU itself, well, the UK's departure wasn't the trigger for its imminent and inevitable collapse. In fact, the rest of Europe is getting on with its life, trying to find more effective solutions to the problem of living together in a complicated and interrelated world. Sometimes the EU succeeds, sometimes it fails, sometimes it does good stuff, sometimes it does bad stuff. Let's not be dewy-eyed about the EU as an organisation. It is as flawed as any other form of human cooperation, but it's just trying to get on with managing problems in an interdependent world. It's just doing it without us. So Brexit isn't a triumph. The EU isn't a grotesque failure. And so the only strategy left by which Johnson can justify Brexit is to simply drive the deepest, most hostile, most bitter wedge that he possibly can between the people of Britain and the rest of Europe. Brexit can only be made a success if our minds are poisoned into thinking that Europeans are our enemies. And that's the only way left for Johnson to make a success of Brexit, is by trying to convince us that the EU is our enemy. And then whatever problems we suffer, whatever downsides we have to live with, they'll be justified because they're our way of fighting back against the enemy. It's terrible, terrible way to behave, but I'm afraid that is his tactic. Finally then, very quickly, I'll move on to a few comments about the third issue, the impact of Brexit upon the internal functioning of the UK itself. Now, we know that for many Leave activists, there wasn't a plan. Brexit was the end. They just wanted to get out, we just want to get out. And they had no idea what would happen next. So they had no plan and no idea. But for many other Leave activists, of course, Brexit was only ever a means to an end. It was only ever the first step in a much longer process of transforming the UK. And they blamed, rightly or wrongly, EU membership on holding back this transformational agenda for the UK itself. So we've had 12 months. It's not a very long time in the big scheme of the world, but we've had 12 months since the end of the transition period. What have we learned about taking back control in that 12-month period? Well, frankly, I'm afraid the results are not particularly inspiring. Now, if you've read the government documents about the things which they're going to change as a result of leaving the EU, you might be left feeling rather incredulous. Remember, it basically boils down to a list which includes putting the crown back on pint glasses. This, of course, is just pure distraction. This is pure distraction. What have we actually learned about what taking back control means? Now, for me as a lawyer and many other lawyers, our focus is on, I suppose it's on the specific ways that Brexit has directly changed the UK constitution and its various fundamental legal and institutional structures. And there's no denying that Brexit has had major changes in that regard. Some of the changes are of a general or systemic nature. We think of something like the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, which you might remember basically converted the whole of EU law into British domestic law. Apart from the thousands of bits that the UK government took upon itself the power to change, amend, reject by ministerial fiat, we can think of the UK Internal Market Act 2020, which basically undermines the devolution settlements for Scotland and Wales by imposing highly centralised principles which favour England and Westminster over Scotland, Cardiff, and the economies of those smaller nations. And of course, there's a whole range of other domestic changes which are directly attributable to Brexit, but maybe more sectoral in nature. They're not systemic or horizontal. They're simply massive changes to the legal regimes in particular areas: customs, trade, agriculture, fisheries, most notoriously perhaps immigration. And of course, there are also various Brexit impacts which are more indirect in nature. We know that the very act of leaving the EU has weakened the ability of the UK courts to hold the government to account for the abuse of state power. One of the major effects of EU membership was to enable the courts to challenge unlawful governmental action more effectively than they were able to do without the EU backing them up and giving them extra tools and powers to do it. So we know that in itself, Brexit weakens the accountability of the government before the courts and through judicial review. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment, and I'm not trying to diminish the importance of those Brexit effects, those direct, systemic, or direct sectoral, or long-term indirect effects of Brexit. But in a way, they are not the most worrying developments of the lot. Actually, the most worrying developments are the ways that the Johnson regime has set about using its power to simply attack the fundamental structures and values of the UK as a liberal democracy. And in that regard, the past 12 months have been deeply worrying. We should all be familiar. Any sentient citizen concerned about the future of their own country should know this list, but I'll rhyme it off anyway. Almost immediately, proposals to restrict even further the power of the courts to scrutinise and challenge the unlawful abuse of governmental power. Attacks on the fundamental freedom to protest, and now proposals simply to impose wider limits on all of our basic fundamental rights as protected under the European Convention on Human Rights. Frankly, sinister proposals to enable the government to strip people of their UK nationality without even having to tell them that it's doing it. Proposals for electoral reform that are clearly and blatantly and partisanly intended to consolidate the government's chances of re-election and undermine the ability of opposition to challenge the government at the ballot box. Governmental, but especially prime ministerial contempt for the constitutional position of Parliament, not only as a forum for decision-making, but also to hold the executive to account. And undermining the devolution settlements, not only through the UK Internal Market Act of 2020, but in the whole attitude and behaviour towards the administrations in Scotland and in Wales. And of course, all of this is covered in a gigantic cesspit's worth of corruption and greed and arrogance on a scale that is frankly difficult to reconcile yourself to without your blood pressure going through the roof. It's really quite unbelievable. Right, on the one level, it's fair to say that none of those things have any inherent link to Brexit. I stress the word inherent, even to the type of deeply damaging hard Brexit that Johnson chose to impose in our relations with the EU. Put simply, Brexit didn't have to end this way. Equally, it's fair to say, a lot of these things could have happened even if the UK had remained a member state of the EU. The experience of countries like Hungary and Poland shows that you can embark on the slippery slope towards a liberal authoritarianism, even as a member state of the EU. And this is a major challenge that the EU itself is currently struggling with in Hungary and Poland. So yes, on the one hand, there's nothing inherent about these really worrying domestic developments and their relationship to Brexit. On the other hand, of course, even if there's no inherent link between Brexit and the Johnson government's attack on liberal democracy in the UK, there's a very compelling connection. It's not inherent, but it's still a very clear and compelling connection. Because both these things, the Brexit project as a whole and the UK's attack on its own liberal democracy, are cut from the same post-truth populist cloth. They each stem from the determination of a political movement that will use whatever tactics, no matter how cynical, how dishonest, how ruthless, to undermine the institutions and values of liberal democracy. Because, of course, it's not just the formal structures of UK democracy that Johnson is attacking. Of course, he's attacking those things with all of these proposals and behaviours. But he's also engaged in a much more sinister attack on the more fundamental values that make any democracy work in a functioning way. He has entirely normalized, in a manner which is totally the same as the vile Trump in America, he has entirely normalized the use of dishonesty as an ordinary tool of political life in the UK. Blatant dishonesty, blatant corruption, with a smile on your face, so arrogant that you actually just shrug your shoulders and you don't care whether people believe you or not anymore. Refusing to accept or admit any degree of responsibility for your own actions, simply as an instinctive reaction, blaming your blatant failures on anyone else in the world. And of course, seeking to distract from that by whipping up these false culture wars, which I have to say, I think is one of the most terrible things that the current regime is doing, actively seeking to pit our society in a war against itself, where we end up trying to create, actively and deliberately, create social division and social conflict purely as a way to help bolster the power ambitions of Boris Johnson and his cabal. It's unforgivable, frankly, it's unforgivable. So while they are not inherently linked together, they are actually very closely connected and they feed each other in a very depressing way. I'll conclude then, I'll conclude. The big worry is, where will all of this end? Where will all of it end? Now, I'm naturally an optimist. You'd never believe it from any of my talks, because I always come across as if I'm the most depressing person on earth, but I'm a natural optimist. I'd like to foresee a world where Johnson, or whoever his mediocre replacement will be, carries on wreaking havoc for another few years, but against the odds, some form of progressive alliance manages to get them out of power, and the main priority of the new government is to actually repair relations with the EU, stabilise the situation in Northern Ireland, and actually reconstitute the UK's liberal democracy to protect it from this type of thing ever happening again. No more Trumpism in our country. That's my optimistic view. Progressive alliance, get them out, and then reconstitute the UK as a protected liberal democracy with strong and positive relations with our neighbours. The problem is, it's equally possible to foresee a world where the Johnson regime continues on its current trajectory, abusing state power to entrench its own partisan position, using blatant populist tactics to cover its tracks, only ever appealing to its core voter base, and not least, seeking to stir up yet further and deeper social division between its own population as a way of bolstering its own power. And the terrifying thing is that that works. And we get another term of this type of behavior, as Trump would so dearly have loved in the US. And then I think effectively we have to worry about the UK simply ceasing to be a functioning liberal democracy. The real worry is that whichever one of those worlds materializes, do they succeed in hanging on to power, or does a progressive alliance succeed in saving us all? There's also another possibility which might well emerge, because one of the problems with populist demons is that once you've stirred them up, you no longer control them. And the worry is that Johnson whips up a part of the population to such a degree of anger and resentment and alienation, where they feel that they were made all of these promises and those promises are being broken, that they simply become permanently alienated from the idea of liberal democracy itself. And they simply no longer believe in liberal democracy as a way of doing business. Then we would have a real problem on our hands, no matter who is in power in the future, because we would have a potentially existential threat to the future of the UK as a liberal democracy to deal with for generations to come. I don't want to live in that sort of world. I want to do everything I possibly can to stop it. And I think we still have time to do that. But frankly, Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens, and the rest of them need to get their bloody act together and start cooperating rather than fighting like children between each other. So that's my tuppence worth. Thank you very much for your attention. I've spoken, I've realized, for a lot longer than I intended to. The beer is obviously a better medicine than the Vicks nasal spray. But I'll hand back to Ian or Peter, I think, for some questions or discussion.